The first thing I heard that Tuesday morning wasn't birds, or lawnmowers, or even my coffee maker finishing its last little gurgle. It was diesel, heavy diesel. Then came the sound of metal tracks grinding against pavement, followed by a voice that barked across my front yard like he owned every inch of it. "Move your truck, old man. The crew's got work to do." I looked through my kitchen window, coffee still in my hand, and saw half a dozen contractors unloading a trenching machine directly onto my lawn while the president of our homeowners association stood there with a clipboard tucked under his arm like it was some kind of sheriff's badge. He wasn't asking permission. He wasn't even pretending to. He was giving orders on property that happened to belong to me. "My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 64 years old, widowed, retired, and for 28 years I worked as a civil engineer reviewing utility easements and public infrastructure projects for Jefferson County, Colorado. I spent most of my career stopping people from making exactly the kind of mistake that was about to unfold outside my window. At the time, though, nobody standing in my yard knew any of that. To them, I was just another retired guy with an old pickup truck, a neat lawn, and too much free time." The HOA president, whose name was Randall Pierce, had only been in charge for about 18 months, but somehow he'd managed to convince himself that becoming board president meant becoming king. Every neighborhood has someone like Randall, the kind of guy who mistakes authority for ownership, confidence for competence, and a printed rule book for actual law. I stepped outside and asked him the simplest question I could think of: digging what? He didn't even look at me. He pointed toward the orange utility flag someone had shoved into my grass. "Fiber optic line. Board approved it last Tuesday." I looked where he pointed, then back at him. "That approval doesn't give you my property." He smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile people wear when they're already celebrating a victory they haven't actually earned yet. "Your property line is whatever the board says it is. Now move the truck before we have it towed." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because I honestly couldn't believe I'd just heard those words come out of another grown man's mouth. Around us, neighbors had started drifting outside. Mrs. Collins across the street suddenly found her roses desperately needed watering. The couple 2 houses down carried folding chairs into their driveway without ever taking their eyes off my yard. Neighborhood drama spreads faster than wildfire, especially when somebody thinks they finally found the grumpy old homeowner who's about to lose a fight with the HOA. Randall loved an audience. You could tell by the way he straightened his shoulders every time another neighbor appeared. He wasn't just installing internet cable anymore. He was putting on a show. I looked at the trenching machine, then at my truck, parked near the side fence. If I moved it, they'd destroy my yard anyway. If I argued, Randall would probably call the sheriff just to make another scene. Instead, I surprised everyone, including myself. I nodded once, turned around, walked back inside, poured another glass of water, and sat at my kitchen table facing the window. My late wife, Emily, used to tell me that silence made arrogant people nervous because it forced them to imagine what you were thinking. She'd been gone almost 6 years, but I could still hear her saying it, so I stayed quiet. Outside, the machine lurched forward. Its steel blade disappeared into my lawn and began carving a trench nearly 2 feet deep. I watched it cross well beyond the recorded easement, cutting straight through landscaping I'd spent years maintaining after Emily passed away. It ripped apart irrigation lines, flower beds she'd planted herself, and the stretch of Kentucky bluegrass she'd always called our little ballpark because it looked so perfectly striped after mowing. Every few minutes, Randall would glance toward my house, almost disappointed that I wasn't storming outside. He wanted to fight. Instead, I gave him something much worse. I gave him time to make his mistake bigger. By sunset, an ugly orange scar stretched across my front yard like an open wound. The contractors packed up. Randall walked to my front door and taped a violation notice right in the center of it. "Obstructing community infrastructure, $400 fine." Then, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, he chuckled and told my next-door neighbor, "Some people just refuse to keep up with community standards." That line stayed with me all night. Community standards. Funny thing about standards, real standards aren't decided by the loudest person holding a clipboard. They're written into deeds, surveys, plats, county records, and laws that don't care how important someone thinks they are. Around 9 the next morning, I climbed into my truck and drove downtown to the county clerk's office, where a few familiar faces still recognized me after all these years. 20 minutes later, I walked out carrying copies of the original subdivision plat, the recorded utility easement, The deed I'd signed back in 1998, and one document I hadn't looked at in almost 3 decades. The original exhibit map, the one with my own signature in the lower right corner, because I had drawn it myself long before Randall Pierce had ever heard of this neighborhood. As I laid those papers across my dining room table, I finally smiled for the first time since the trenching machine arrived, because I realized something Randall hadn't. He hadn't just crossed my property line. He'd crossed into my profession, my history, and the one fight I knew better than almost anyone alive. The biggest advantage of getting older isn't wisdom, at least not the kind people write on greeting cards. It's pattern recognition. After you've spent almost 3 decades reviewing easements, right-of-way disputes, drainage conflicts, and utility projects, you stop reacting to noise and start looking for paperwork. Paperwork tells the truth far more often than people do. I spread every document across my dining room table, grabbed a yellow legal pad, and started comparing dimensions one line at a time. Within 15 minutes, I had already found the first problem. The recorded utility easement measured exactly 15 feet from the western property boundary. Randall's contractor hadn't stopped at 15 feet. They'd gone almost 35, 20 feet beyond the easement, directly through privately owned land. I measured it twice because I almost didn't believe they'd been that careless. Then I measured it a third time just to enjoy the moment. Around noon, I drove back to the neighborhood, this time carrying an old survey tripod I'd kept in my garage for sentimental reasons. A couple neighbors watched me set it up from across the street. Mrs. Collins wandered over pretending she needed exercise. "Everything okay, Daniel?" she asked. I smiled. "Better than okay." She looked confused, then watched me place temporary stakes exactly where the legal easement ended. Every orange trench marker the contractor had installed sat well outside those stakes. I didn't touch a thing. I simply photographed everything from every angle, then recorded slow video while explaining measurements aloud, just like we documented field inspections back when I worked for the county. Evidence ages well when it's organized. That afternoon, I visited the contractor's office instead of calling. People reveal more face-to-face than they ever do over the phone. The project superintendent, a tired-looking man named Luis Ortega, greeted me politely. Before I said anything, I complimented the quality of their trench work. He seemed surprised. Most homeowners only showed up angry. I introduced myself and explained my background. His expression changed immediately. He pulled the permit packet from a filing cabinet without any hesitation. That's when the second crack appeared in Randall's little kingdom. The county permit clearly authorized installation only within the existing recorded utility corridor. Louis frowned while comparing his paperwork to the photographs on my phone. "Our crew followed the HOA representative," he admitted quietly. "He insisted the easement had been expanded years ago." "Did he provide revised survey drawings?" I asked. Louis slowly shook his head. "No, sir." "Did anyone verify his claim?" Another pause. "No." He leaned back in his chair and sighed. "I don't think you're actually upset with us." I smiled. "No, I think somebody lied to you." Before leaving, I asked for copies of the permit application, work order, and the signed project authorization. Every signature belonged to Randall Pierce. Every instruction directing the crew came from Randall Pierce. Every liability trail began with Randall Pierce. On my way home, I stopped at my attorney's office. Her name was Sarah Whitaker, and we crossed paths countless times during county infrastructure hearings 20 years earlier. She was one of those lawyers who never raised her voice because she never needed to. I laid the documents across her conference table without saying much. She read quietly for nearly 20 minutes before finally looking up over her glasses. "Daniel," she said, "how angry are you?" I shrugged. "Not very," she smiled. "Good. Angry clients make emotional decisions. Calm clients usually win." We spent the next 3 hours building a timeline. Original deed, recorded plat, easement dimensions, permit conditions, contractor statements, drone photographs one of my neighbors had accidentally captured while flying his hobby drone over the cul-de-sac that morning, security camera footage from my garage showing exactly when the trench crossed the legal boundary. Then Sarah asked a question I hadn't considered. Did the HOA bylaws say anything about owner consent? I reached for another folder. I'd already printed them that morning. Section 9. Paragraph 4. Any underground installation outside designated corridors required written approval from the affected landowner before construction could begin. Sarah actually laughed. Not loudly, just enough to appreciate the irony. They violated county regulations, property law, and their own governing documents all before lunch. Over the next week, we kept digging, though not with machinery. Financial records obtained through Discovery requests showed Randall had pushed the project through without waiting for the engineering review committee. Meeting minutes had been edited after the vote. One board member submitted an affidavit stating she never approved construction outside the easement and had specifically asked for updated surveys before authorizing anything. Her request mysteriously disappeared from the final minutes. Another board member admitted Randall insisted there was no need to bother Daniel because old property records confuse people. That sentence would eventually become one of the most expensive opinions he'd ever express. Meanwhile, Randall kept acting like nothing had happened. Every few days, another email landed in my inbox demanding payment of the $400 violation fine. One even threatened to place a lien against my property if I continued refusing to cooperate with community infrastructure improvements. Sarah told me not to respond. Every email they sent without consulting legal counsel is another gift, she said. So I stayed quiet. Again. Silence irritated Randall more than resistance ever could. One Saturday morning, he actually walked across my driveway while I was washing my truck. "You planning to pay that fine?" he asked with a grin. I rinsed the soap off the hood before answering. "No." "Then the board will escalate. I'm counting on it." His smile faded just enough for me to notice. He searched my face, probably looking for frustration or fear. Instead, he found someone discussing tomorrow's weather. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he muttered. I dried my hands on a towel. "No, Randall. You already made it harder than it needed to be. You just haven't figured out for who." He stared another second before walking away. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The following week, Sarah sent a formal demand letter requesting a special executive session with the HOA board before litigation commenced. No threats. No dramatic language. Just facts, statutes, photographs, survey exhibits, and a deadline. Randall accepted immediately, probably convinced he could intimidate another homeowner across a conference table the same way he'd done for my front lawn. What he didn't realize was that this meeting wasn't about negotiation anymore. It was about documentation. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep much. Not because I was nervous about losing. That possibility had disappeared days earlier. I kept thinking about Emily. She loved that front yard. Every spring, she'd spend weekends planting flowers while I complained about digging irrigation trenches. And she'd laugh because somehow she always convinced me to help anyway. Looking at the damaged lawn hurt more than I admitted to anyone. It wasn't really about grass anymore. It was about someone deciding they could erase years of someone else's life because a board vote made them feel important. Early the next morning, I walked outside before sunrise. Fresh dew covered the scar carved across my yard. The orange paint marks still glowed faintly against the dirt. I stood there for several minutes with my hands in my pockets, then quietly said, "We're almost done, Em." By 10 o'clock, Sarah and I were walking into the clubhouse carrying two identical binders nearly 3 inches thick. Through the conference room window, I could already see Randall sitting at the head of the table, leaning back comfortably, joking with the other board members like he was about to collect another victory. He glanced toward the binders, then toward me, and smiled with exactly the same confidence he'd worn the morning he ordered that trenching machine onto my lawn. He still believed this was a disagreement. He had absolutely no idea he was about to attend the most expensive board meeting in the history of that neighborhood. The conference room inside the clubhouse was quieter than I'd ever seen it. Usually there was coffee brewing, neighbors chatting, somebody complaining about landscaping contracts or mailbox colors. That morning, the only sound was the air conditioner humming overhead. Randall Pierce sat at the head of the table with his usual confidence, one arm draped across the back of his chair. Tapping a pin against a legal pad like this meeting was nothing more than another homeowner coming in to ask for a reduced fine. The other board members nodded politely as Sarah and I walked in carrying our binders. Randall couldn't resist taking the first shot. "Mr. Mercer," he said with a grin, "if you're here to discuss the violation notice, we can probably arrange a payment plan." A couple people around the table chuckled. Sarah didn't even bother sitting down right away. She placed one binder in front of Randall, another in front of the association's attorney, then quietly said, "I'd recommend opening to tab 1. The room went silent. Randall looked irritated more than concerned, flipping open the binder almost carelessly. The first page wasn't an argument. It was the recorded subdivision plat. Behind that came the deed, then the easement survey, then aerial photographs, then permit documents, then contractor statements, then copies of the HOA bylaws. Every section highlighted, every page numbered, every fact connected to the next one. Sarah finally took her seat and folded her hands. Mr. Pierce, on the morning of May 12th, you directed excavation approximately 20 feet beyond the recorded utility easement onto privately owned property without written consent from the owner. You did so despite county permit restrictions and despite your own governing documents requiring homeowner authorization. Randall leaned back and laughed once. That's your opinion? Sarah slid another document across the table. No, that's your contractor's sworn statement. His smile faded. She placed another page on top. This is the county permit limiting work to the recorded corridor. Another page. This is your email instructing the contractor to ignore the original survey. Another page. This is the board member affidavit confirming concerns about the missing engineering review. Even the association's attorney had stopped taking notes. Then Sarah turned toward me. Daniel. I reached into my folder and pulled out one sheet of paper I'd been waiting almost 3 weeks to show. It wasn't flashy. Just an aging engineering exhibit with faded ink in the lower corner. I slid it toward Randall. Recognize the signature? He stared for several seconds before reading the name. Mine. Dated 1998. I drafted the original exhibit map for this subdivision before half these houses were built, I said calmly. I know every measurement because I created them. The color drained from his face so quickly it almost looked painful. For the first time since we'd met, Randall had absolutely nothing to say. Sarah let the silence linger before continuing. Our demand is straightforward. Full restoration of the property, replacement of damaged irrigation, professional landscaping, compensation for diminished property value, attorney fees, statutory damages for unauthorized excavation and trespass. She pushed the final page toward the center of the table. $94,000. Payment due by Friday at 5 p.m. If payment is not received, suit will be filed Monday morning. The association's attorney finally cleared his throat. He looked directly at Randall instead of at us. Did you actually tell the contractor the easement had been expanded? Randall tried to answer, but nothing came out. He swallowed, adjusted his tie, then mumbled something about acting in the community's best interest. The attorney interrupted him. That wasn't my question. One by one, the board members started turning toward Randall instead of toward me. It was fascinating to watch. The same people who had applauded his confidence a month earlier were now quietly calculating how much that confidence was about to cost every homeowner in the neighborhood. One woman shook her head after reading the bylaw section she'd apparently never seen before. Another whispered, "He never told us this." The meeting ended less than 20 minutes later. There were no dramatic speeches, no shouting, no courtroom theatrics, just paperwork doing exactly what paperwork was designed to do. Thursday afternoon, one day before the deadline, Sarah called while I was replacing a bird feeder in the backyard. Funds have been transferred, she said simply. Full amount. I thanked her, hung up, and stood there for another minute listening to birds argue over sunflower seeds. Funny how peaceful everything sounded once the fighting was over. Over the next several weeks, the HOA hired a completely different contractor to remove the improperly installed fiber line and reroute it around my property entirely at the association's expense. My irrigation system was rebuilt. Fresh Kentucky bluegrass replaced the torn soil. Emily's flower beds were replanted using photographs I'd found in an old family album, so they matched almost exactly the way she'd arranged them years before. Standing there watching new grass take root felt strangely emotional. It wasn't because I'd won money. Money was never the point. The point was proving that ownership still meant something, that records still mattered, and that no elected neighborhood volunteer could simply vote away another person's rights because it was convenient. Randall resigned 8 days after the settlement became public. A month later, the entire board approved new policies requiring independent surveys before any future construction project touched private property. Ironically, the neighborhood became better because of the very mistake Randall refused to admit. Every now and then, I still see him at the grocery store or walking his dog a few streets over. We don't speak. We don't need to. He usually looks down when we pass each other, and I keep walking because some victories don't need another word after they're finished. But every spring when I mow that front lawn and those stripes catch the afternoon sunlight, I think about Emily smiling from the porch, telling me that quiet people are dangerous because everyone underestimates them. She was right. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do isn't yell, threaten, or fight back in the moment. Sometimes it's letting someone believe they've already won while they leave a trail of evidence straight to their own downfall. Now I'm curious what you think. If someone had started digging across your property without permission, would you have stopped the machine right then and there? Or would you have done what I did and let them keep digging until they'd buried themselves in their own mistake? Let me know in the comments, because I honestly think this is one of those situations where reasonable people could make very different choices, and I'd love to hear where you stand.